Hi everyone, my name is Shamir and this is my presentation on racism and the impact on families at risk. So the definition for racism is prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism directed against a person or people based on their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Some related definitions to racism is race, which refers to the categories in which society places individuals on the basis of physical characteristics such as skin color, hair type, facial form, and eye shape. Systemic racism is a combination of systems, institutions, and factors that advantage white people. Systemic racism also causes widespread harm and disadvantages in access and opportunity, and disadvantages in access to resources and opportunities to people of color. So a little bit of history. As we know, racism stems back to the slavery era. So between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million people were kidnapped from Africa and sent to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. Only about 10.7 of those people survived the 2-month-long journey. And once they, came over to the Americas, they were pretty much treated as property and traded and forced into slavery by maintaining crops, being maid servants, raising children, things of that nature. American society developed the notion of race early in its formation to justify its new economic system of capitalism, which depended on the institution of forced labor, especially the enslavement of African people. Something else that I thought was important for racism and families at risk was the broken windows theory. So the broken windows theory of policing was popularized by the work of Wilson and Kelling in 1982, and it argued that when community disorder reaches a critical mass, it creates a more serious problem of crime and urban decay. So using the broken window analogy, it was hypothesized that broken windows in a community depicts a sign of instability, decay, high crime rate, and lack of order and social control. So pretty much the broken windows approach was an aggressive crime fighting strategy instituted in New York in the 1990s, and it emphasized mass arrests of perpetrators of major as well as minor offenses. The problem with this is the impact resulted in disproportionate arrests of Black and Hispanic youth in comparison to Caucasians. So the neighborhoods that have these issues like broken windows, like we see in the photo, abandoned buildings, just trash everywhere, it's just unorganized. These kind of neighborhoods are where a high police presence is. And unfortunately, these neighborhoods are where a majority of minorities, African American, Hispanics, other people of color reside. And these are where our families at risk are staying. So that was interesting. Where I live at, there's a neighborhood that is actually fits the broken windows theory. It was, abandoned buildings, broken windows, trash everywhere, just not taken care of. And they've since started to build like new homes in the area. The grass and everything is nice. And so I've actually seen like a less, police presence. I've seen actually new people move into the neighborhood. So, rebuilding those communities actually, it helps and it works. So a couple of at-risk factors. So one of the at-risk factors is mental health, of course. Racism is a traumatic event. So when your body experiences a traumatic event, you kind of go into like the fight or flight mode. And, once you're in that mode, you're like panicking, your heart rate increases, you experience depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety, things of that nature. Something else is the criminal justice system. As we all know, African Americans, minorities, other people of color are arrested at higher rates than Caucasians. So they represent a majority of the criminal justice system. They also get longer prison sentences. They don't always get the appropriate legal representation that they need. They come out of prison, they're on probation forever. So it's kind of like a never ending system. It's like a cycle. Also, employment is a little harder to get for individuals who live in these at-risk communities and at-risk families because transportation is an issue. A lot of the times they don't have vehicles, they got to catch the bus. So you're sitting at the bus stop all day and night waiting for one, sometimes two or three buses to get you where you need to go. And then also when they are employed, they're working 2 and 3 jobs, which is leaving their children at home by themselves to fend for themselves. So, they start having these behaviors, they start hanging out with the wrong group of people, and then it kind of escalates from there. Another risk factor is income. It's known that, African Americans and Caucasians and other people of different races and minorities, they don't make as much as, their Caucasian counterpoints. So, salary discrepancy is very much a real thing. So this is just a little chart that I found that I thought was cool. It's the mental health effects of racism. And so, like I said, when someone experiences racism, they are sad, they're depressed, they have suicidal thoughts, anxiety, they have distress, they have anger, they have a lack of energy, they have internalized racism, and they start to believe the negative messages about themselves, and they have a decreased self-worth. Also how it affects the body, inflammation, higher cortisol levels, higher blood pressure, increased heart rate, decreased immune function. It also makes you nervous. It makes you scared, because you don't know what's going to happen. Racial slurs, someone calling you a racial slur, but, what comes after that racial slur? Are you going to be attacked? Are you going to be harmed? So, racism has a huge impact on those who experience it. Some other risk factors are discrimination, discrimination among African American and Caribbean Black youth is linked to higher risk of suicidal behavior. Latinos experience discrimination, Latinos experiences of discrimination increase the risk of mental health issues by 3.5 times than among foreign-born whites. Arab Americans were more likely to experience prejudice than African American, Asian Americans, and Latinas. And this is just another little chart on, exposure to racial discrimination. Exposure at the individual levels, childhood experiences of racial discrimination, which includes teasing, bullying, isolation, observation of a parent or family member, empirical experiences of racial discrimination, quality of parenting, and racial socialization. Quality of parenting is impacted by racism. Some psychological and biological responses, hopelessness, anxiety, anger, like I said in the previous slide, increased blood pressure, perceptions of injustice, low levels of empathy, child health, outcomes and disparities, increased likelihood to have a low birth weight, a higher risk for premature, increased risk of risky behaviors such as substance use, sexually acting out, increased, aggressive behaviors. Experiencing racism really makes you angry, and I've seen individuals, become aggressive and change, just simply because being called a racial slur. Laws and policies that, promote racism and can continue to keep families at risk from getting what they needed to bring themselves up and move forward. So in 1933, the federal government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So it was to expand on homeownership as a part of the recovery from the Great Depression. So it used racial composition as part of its assessment. So the HOLC staff drew red lines around communities with large black populations, flagging them as hazardous investment areas whose residents would not receive the HOLC loans. So it made mortgages less accessible, rendering prospective black home buyers vulnerable to predatory terms. Brown versus the Board of Education, it was designed to, render racial segregation in education as unlawful. However, many black students are educated outside the mainstream general education classroom and fall victim to educational disruption before 12th grade. The black students were also disproportionately labeled as having emotional behavior disorders and intellectual disabilities. In the Jim Crow era, which is the practice of lynching, which was a form of racialized social control established by plantation overseers or policemen during slavery, and it was later used as a police tactic during the Jim Crow era. So between 1800 through 1950, there were at least 3,500 lynchings to keep people of color from uprising. And of course, like we see in today's current events, communities of color experience extensive police surveillance, use of physical and deadly force, officer misconduct, and slow response time when they're called. And then these are just some more laws and policies. Continue, Indian Removal Act. The Indian community were forced out of their land. And then Nixon's war on drugs, of course, load up the prisons with African American, people of color, long prison sentences for petty drug crimes. And, the civil rights movements, which tried to combat all this stuff and, try to help the African American community and communities of color, get through this and get the equal rights that they deserved. So some services that are here in Delaware, of course, Delaware Center for Justice, which works a lot with, families who are at risk, the African American community, and other communities of color. They provide housing assistance, job searches, mental health services, substance use referrals, vocational placements, life skills, and as well as social supports. The Latin American Community Center is an organization that works strictly with the Hispanic community in Delaware, and they serve the communities through advocacy. They offer continual care programs and services to anyone who needs the assistance. They have programs that assist with lifelong learning, life empowerment, immediate life needs, immediate life needs that the families may be facing. They also help with case management, job placement, and learning English. A lot of Hispanic individuals here in Delaware, they don't speak English, and it's very, very difficult for them to do things. Very difficult to communicate with the schools with their children. So their children, are in school, not understanding. Teachers can't communicate with them. So that's a huge issue that I experienced when I was working with adolescents and youth. The language barrier for families at risk, especially in the Latino community. And of course, you have your traditional therapy services when you see, therapists one-on-one. And, you discuss those issues. You work on coping strategies, coping mechanisms to help you overcome experiencing racism. So interventions at the micro level includes, support the client through a combination of therapeutic modalities and outpatient or inpatient mental health care setting. Advocate for your client, make sure they're getting, what they need. Assist with getting access to resources. It's very hard for families at risk to get access to resources, so they do really need help navigating the mental health and social services aspect of things to get what they need for their families. Meso level, identify inequality that lead efforts to correct imbalances affecting marginalized individual populations. Identify factors that affect well-being of multiple clients within organizations like schools, social service agencies, or within small communities such as youth at risk and in inner city neighborhoods. And collaborate with other client systems and agencies implementing programs and advocating for services and resources. And then at the macro level, make mental health services more accessible. Evidence shows that mental health services do improve mental health systems for individuals who have been exposed to trauma, and racism is a trauma. Some of the barriers to mental health is transportation, the cost, location, and make the services difficult to obtain. And then, of course, organizations, campaigns, such as the Black Lives Matter campaign that we hear so much about. And in conclusion, racism continues to be an issue. African Americans and people of color continue to suffer from it. Hate crimes have increased for Asian Americans, and police brutality